She had everything. Built up from immense tragedy, Esther rebuilt what once was lost. Anyone would have been defensive of this structure of newfound stability and of newfound abilities. So it is to no surprise that upon hearing about news that might tamper with this state, that Esther's initial instincts were to retreat. For very often do we just sojourn through the journey, just taking what we need, and then we leave. We leave, and we leave, and we leave until we feel comfortable, where we can then sow our seeds somewhere which puts us at ease. But the world doesn't stop to coordinate with our perceptions or accomplishments. It was during this time of celebration and victory where the vengeance of revenge sprouted from another king named Haman, leading to the mass genocide of the Jews. Scripture says this was because Mordecai refused to bow down to Haman, and that thus led to Haman being angered and ordering this genocide. And of course, genocide of any kind is always corrupt and unjust. But to add salt to the wound, because it was Esther's blood relation, as Mordecai was Esther's cousin who took her in once her parents had passed, this meant that the genocide of the Jews meant the killing of her too. But Esther did not know of this order, at least not until Mordecai had told Esther, and that is when Esther 4:9-17 occurs. While in the Bible, this is a quick exchange when we can read it in less than a minute or two, so it is very easy to just skim past or to not really think about too much. But what's happening between these exchanges are immense ponderings and decisions that are being made between both Mordecai and Esther. For it was not a mere conversation they were having, because Esther had to report through her talk what she wanted to say to Mordecai. Therefore, she had to think about it, ponder what she wanted to do, and then report back to him. And she had to think about her response before sending it off. But this wasn't just a purely moral decision to be made. Of course, if any of us heard of a genocide, we just call it off. It would be simple as that, because it is the moral and the just thing to do. But Esther also had to realize that this also would affect her as well. So it made the decision all the more frightening, because she could go and advocate for the Jews and try to stop the genocide. But if she did, and she wasn't granted that golden scepter, she would be killed right there and then, and all of her efforts to try to help the Jews would be dismissed. But also, if she didn't, it would mean the mass genocide and killing of many, many people who she loved and valued most. And Esther knew this was a challenge because she hadn't been called for 30 days. And when Esther tells Mordecai her concerns about this, and he replies to her telling her that, well, your silence in the castle will not help you, as silence never does. Mordecai knows that even if Esther were not to tell the king her response and what she wants to do and try to help prevent them from doing this genocide, that somehow the Jews would figure out a way and save themselves, but under much bloodier and violent circumstances. And she suggested that with Esther's influence and her power, that she could really have a say in how this might go. So thus, Esther came to a question on what she wanted to do, and that was passivity or proactivity. In both circumstances, the outcome and outputs of what would happen would be detrimental. If Esther remained passive, that meant that the Jews would be killed, and then possibly her too. But if she didn't, which would probably lessen her chance of getting killed, she would, flip that. But if she did, it would heighten her chance of getting killed because she would be risking her life for her advocacy. But Esther knew that passivity was not the answer. There was something interesting about the book of Esther that I found upon researching the book of Esther, as I haven't really heard about much before. It's not really one of the main scriptures that I hear about, especially when you're growing old and hear all these scriptures in Sunday school. But when I researched it, it is actually one of the few Bibles or one of the books in the Bible that does not mention God whatsoever. It is one of two in the Bible. And thus, theologians have kind of speculated and pondered whether or not it even deserves a place in the Bible. But despite the absence of God that's perceived in this scripture, one of the main reasons why it has stayed in the book of the Bible is because of the guidance and the messaging that comes with its teachings that is of God. Because in the end, Esther did tell CUCC to tell Mordecai to gather the Jews and have them fast, and then when they were gathered, she would go talk to the king. And then she says what I believe to be the most powerful line in the book of Esther from what I read. And if I perish, I perish. Because Esther knew that passivity was not the answer. Not just because her actions had an impact on not just herself and the people around her, but also because not because proactivity was easier either, as it certainly was not, but because she knew that a passive heart is hardly a heart at all, for it is hardened and blocked by fear, obedience, and submission to what the mind perceives as right, often defying the right thing to do. And Esther knew then that proactivity was what must be done. So she goes to the king and when she goes, she is granted the golden scepter, meaning that she was not killed for her advocacy. But when she goes, they're not able to stop the genocide, but they are able to punish. Haman and his what he ordered. And they were able to assist the Jews in the genocide and fight against the people, their enemies, who were attacking them. And later, this advocacy and Esther's advocacy for the Jews allowed for them to defend against their enemies and to later gain power. Okay, now the story time's complete for this section. But what does this story possibly mean for us? Because when we hear of these grand stories, especially in the Bible, it can be very easy to brush past them and be like, oh, well, of course, we're not in positions of royalty. We're not making these big decisions that have these very, very large impacts. So what do I take from this? And what I believe to be the message here is that there is a very godlike quality in the act of selflessness and helping those who need it most. And now I want to tell you guys a story about how I have connected this to my own personal life. When I was younger, I was always regarded as a goody tissue. I always sat in my seat with crisscrossed hands and the straightest possible posture one could imagine during my classes. And I would sit there quiet and reserved, just waiting for instruction. But I also recall how there were many times when my teacher would sit me by a more restless kid, someone who was either defined by the act of non-listening or just someone who has an apathy to try in school. And looking back, this was definitely an attempt to try to get my behaviors and habits to rub off on the kid next to me. But time after time again, I would remain quiet. The teacher sitting positioning of me was merely something I had to just get through until the next seating chart came. And until then, I just waited through the day, slightly annoyed and highly anticipating that long-awaited day of that seat change. But until then, I knew I would be fine, despite the irritable pencil taps beside me or the constant sitting and standings of the person beside me, or the constant, what did you get, after every period of their non-listening. I knew I would be all right, despite this all. And this was a cycle that descended time after time again, and year after year. And sometimes my good behavior even got me to move up my cliff, and sometimes also to get a candy out of that idolized treasure box we get in childhood. Therefore, it was kind of like Esther, where at this time, I too had everything, or rather, everything a child could possibly want in a school setting. But as time went by, I started to interact more with this classmate of mine. Short exchanges came about, and I began to build a better tolerance to his habits and behaviors and his antics at times. And soon enough, I walked into the classroom, and there was another seating chart on the board. And I excitedly looked to scout for my name, like, oh, thank you that the seat has changed. But to my surprise, I was still sat by this kid. And I then dreadfully made my way to my seat, wondering why in the world the teacher put me by him again. And it felt unfair, really, because all of my friends were basically sitting next to each other, and I did not know why this was, because how I viewed it, I wasn't really helping this kid. He was still acting out. He still wasn't listening to the teacher. But whether I realized it or not in the moment, looking back, there was a change. But it was something subtle. I had become one of the few people in that classroom who he actually listened to time from time. And in that week of reflection, I also realized I had been, without even really noticing it, helping him too. Not just because he gave him the answers whenever he told me, oh, what did you get? But because when I did, I explained myself and how I got that answer. I figured perhaps if I told him how to do it, maybe next time he wouldn't be bugging me for it or say, hey, what'd you get? Okay, tell me what that is? Oh, thanks. And I thought it would make my life much easier. And I remember each time I would explain, though, he would listen. And in the moment, I thought it was just because he was trying to be nice, so I would give him the answers to him the next time. But he could have easily looked over my shoulder or tried to see what I got on my answers were, or he could have just took my paper and when we had a classwork and copied it over himself. But he did not. And when we had our next math test, this time I was clear. So I'm okay, let me see if he's actually improving in this class. And I looked over to see what he got when we got our tests back, and he got an A, which was contrary to what he had been getting in the past, because from time to time I did see what he would be getting. And it was after this test where he also started to listen to me a bit more and to try to get to know how to actually do this stuff. Although he was still acting out and still not listening from time to time, this was actually helping him, even in this very small, minuscule way. And while I'm not going to pretend like this was all my doing, as it certainly was not, I'm sure there was many people behind the scenes helping this kid out. But looking back at these times, I realized that this was just someone who is trying to survive in this very turbulent life of ours. I do not know what was going on behind the scenes for him, but what I do know is the way in which he acted out was not necessarily without cause. As mended from our histories, we carry the weight of what we think we can hold, acting out in the way we think is best. And so I kept helping him out, and because although it was a bit of an inconvenience to me, and I was fine not helping him. I didn't have to help this kid out, but I did it because I knew it was for good and that I was helping someone who needed it. And while like Esther, there was a bit of selfishness in our decisions because it did have an impact on ourselves, there was also a bit of selflessness that came in what we did because it helped someone who needed it, a helping hand. But at that age, I had no clue about the book of Esther, of course. I had never read a whole book in the Bible by that time, and I just didn't know its teachings. But what I do know is that despite the perceived absence of God that may be kind of put onto the situation, as it was when I was very young and little, I didn't know much about God or the Bible or its teachings. I know that, like Esther's decision and it not having really a direct link to God, that these qualities that were exhibited were of him. And eventually, my classmates' poor behavior did get him kicked out of the school, and he had to go to another one. But even if momentarily, I was able to help someone in the way I could. While it was not life-saving or life-changing for this kid, it was something. And while Esther was not able to necessarily prevent the genocide from happening, she was able to help the Jews defend against themselves. And when you think about it, there was nothing more godlike or gracious in this world than the act of selflessness. Because if you think about it, God sent his only son here, and he didn't have to come in human flesh, but he did, because God loved us so much that he gave us his only son to help those on the margins and to help those who needed it most. So while we may not be able to change the world, we can help in the ways that we can, even when it feels useless, and even when it feels like nothing is really happening. For proactivity in a world where passivity has become the standard is one of the most important things we can do. Because yes, it is much easier to ignore others, kind of to worry about ourselves, the people in our own social circle. There is a hollow heart that lies in passivity, but there is a tender heart that lies in proactivity. And currently in the world, there are, on a much larger scale, things are going south, with SNAP benefits being kind of delayed for people and people being stolen away from their families. The world is shifting in ways we likely would have never imagined, and in ways that we feared. And as we hear these things happening out in the world, it is very easy to feel disillusioned and to feel helpless. But the world doesn't stop to coordinate with our perceptions or our perspectives. There are things we can do, even on small scales, and choices we can make, and things we can do to help. The world can only improve when we allow it to, person by person and action by action. Then the dominoes can descend, fall and fall, pushing us together, forming a string of noise and giving the once silent a voice. But also, it is okay if you try something and nothing happens, because when we play dominoes, sometimes only one or two fall when we push it over. But that does not mean we can't rebuild it. Sometimes the most powerful thing that we can do is to keep trying and to push through even when hopelessness comes. Especially in a world where right now the aim is to try to box our voices off and to kind of prevent them from voicing and advocating for what is right. But if we keep trying, there is hope. And maybe one day there will come stability and a beautiful, loving world filled with abundant communities, where lamplights of individual love might light this world on fire from the heat of them all. So now I want to ask you this one simple question: passivity or proactivity? Thank you.